So I'm going to move us along. Thank you again for joining us. So our next presenter is Chief Justice Pamela Williams, Nova Scotia. She's calling to us from Nova Scotia as a coordinated system of justice and treatment courts, and she's here to discuss the rationale, operation, and impacts of this system. So Chief Justice Williams was appointed as a judge to the Provincial Family Court System in September of 2003. She's presided over youth and adult criminal proceedings and occasional family court matters. Between 2006 and 2010, she was the primary youth court judge in the Metro Youth Justice Court. Since then, has been a dedicated judge in the Dartmouth Wellness Courts and presides over adult criminal court. Further details about her bio is in your bulletin, but without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Justice Williams.
Thank you, and I'm going to try and share my screen. Okay, so thank you for the invitation to participate. And I too wanted to extend my appreciation to Nicoletta in particular. I'm always learning something from First Voice, and she makes a really great point about quality of life perhaps being one of the primary pillars of wellness courts. And certainly the human centered focus is crucial. So I'm starting off with the slogan, which says, just because you have a past does not mean you have no future. That was a slogan that was created haphazard by one of our participants, who was a young Indigenous man at the time. And when he said it to me, he said, you know, he and I were just having a chat, and he said, Judge Williams, just because you have a past doesn't mean you have no future. And I said, wow, Jimmy, that's really profound. So I asked him to repeat it. We wrote it down, and we got somebody else to actually prepare the slogan. It now sits behind the bench in the wellness court. And I've been told many times that it's had quite the impact on people who are coming into the courtroom, especially for the first time, and they feel somewhat more comfortable in that setting. So the key objectives of my presentation are twofold. One is to review the creation and evolution of therapeutic courts in Nova Scotia, and then to highlight the work of our Wellness Court Steering Committee, why it was created, when it was created, how it works, and how it strengthens partnerships and sustains programs, and end off with some of the strategic planning that we're doing. So why create a therapeutic court? Some may ask. Others may say, duh, makes perfect sense. I'm going to look at as well at the Nova Scotia Mental Health Court evolution and what I call the organic creation of some wellness or therapeutic courts across the province. And when I use the term organic, what I mean is grassroots from the bottom up without government funding or planning. So we know that wellness courts reduce reoffending, that they have a recovery-oriented focus, or as Nicoletta said, the quality of life focus. They address root causes of offending early on and bring in a wide range of supports, of services from an interdisciplinary team. Restorative approaches are used, which I think can lead to better mechanisms for ensuring safety of the public. And they provide an opportunity for victims to be heard in any number of ways, whether it's direct involvement, being provided with updates, attending court appearances, or providing input into support plans. So the next 3 slides are thanks to the legal aid lawyer in our court who prepared them for another presentation, but I thought it was a really succinct presentation of the evolution of our court. So the first court, which was called the Nova Scotia Mental Health Court, which was created by largely, but not exclusively, government funding, opened in November of 2009, and we started with 2 clinicians, a nurse and a nurse and a social worker. We also had a probation officer, defense and crown. We had an administrative support and a judge who were the part of the core team. And our focus really was on, at the time, Access 1 diagnoses, and it was offender-based, meaning that there were very few offenses excluded, and that guilty pleas were not required to participate in the program. But as we all know, things never stay static, and a good wellness court is nimble enough and flexible enough to do some soul searching and introspection on an ongoing basis to determine how we can get rid of that. How we can improve. And so in 2014, I'm sure there were many changes between 2009, 2014, but early on, for example, borderline personality disorder was not something that we could deal with. It was often there was no programming that was available. So in 2014, we expanded to include borderline personality disorders as a standalone diagnosis that was eligible for the court. And around the same time, we started planning for a drug court, because there was a tiny bit of federal funding provided for another location in Nova Scotia, not like the 5 or 6 fully funded drug treatment courts across the country, but it did get some limited funding. And we looked at that and we said, you know what, we've got the nucleus of a group where we could expand and create our own drug treatment court. And so at that time, where drugs were the driver and custody was a likely outcome, we were requiring guilty pleas on those matters. So we created what we call the Court Monitoring Drug Treatment Program in 2015, but it was only for opioids because we needed to partner with Nova Scotia Health and Addictions, and they had an opioid treatment program that we were able to partner with. And so we limited ourselves, but we were able to deal with those types of issues. And we, as well at that time, looked at ways in which we could get early intervention and early involvement from victims. We know that in the criminal justice system, there's a thing called a victim impact statement, but it's only available once a guilty plea is provided. However, in our court, where guilty pleas were not required, we needed to come up with another mechanism. And so we called it a victim voice statement, which is very much similar to a victim impact statement, but created opportunity for victims' involvement. Then in 2016, we addressed a dilemma head on, and that was, in looking at our statistics, we weren't seeing many marginalized, racialized participants. And we very quickly realized the reason was that many of them did not have diagnoses, so they didn't have eligibility criteria established. And the reason was they didn't have the trust in the mental health systems to have gone and sought treatment and received a diagnosis. And so we created this program to address and involve some Indigenous and African Nova Scotia applicants who were dealing with significant trauma issues. So in 2017, we're still on a roll, and we addressed the elephant in the room, which is alcohol. So back in 2009, there was a deliberate decision not to include alcohol as a mental health issue for admission into the court, largely because it was a floodgates issue. Alcohol was a huge problem and we just didn't have capacity. But in the fall of 2017, we introduced an alcohol project to target alcohol use disorder, again, partnering with community residential facilities to work alongside in the community with folks. 2018, we were gearing up for our 10-year anniversary, and we were considering a lot of our lessons learned. And one of the things that we decided was perhaps it was time for a name change. So the court originally, as you'll recall, was the Nova Scotia Mental Health Court. And it didn't take long for folks across the province to say, why do you call it a Nova Scotia Mental Health Court when it only services Metro, Halifax, Dartmouth? So at this point in time, we thought 10 years later, it might be appropriate to rebrand our court. And so we decided to call it the Wellness Court. We included criteria to involve trauma, so we no longer needed the judicial monitoring program. We moved away from court-monitored drug treatment to the opioid treatment court program branding. And we added a third clinician to our ranks, which was an occupational therapist. It also marked a change in that we were no longer accepting driving offenses, in large part because there were changes to the criminal code. There were no longer curative discharge provisions. And although the federal government provided opportunity for programs to be created within provinces to address the issues, none had been created in Nova Scotia. And we felt that we would be inundated with these types of matters. And so unfortunately, we had to make that change. 2020 saw a change for everyone with the arrival of COVID. And we shut down for a very short period of time, but it didn't take us long to gear up and go virtually. I must say it was difficult. Not seeing people in person made it more difficult to understand where they were in their journey, understand whether they were having increased symptoms of illness or increased use of substances. And as difficult as COVID was for us, it was exponentially more difficult for the participants in our program. A lot of stress, a lot of worry, a lot of isolation, which led to deterioration of mental health. And so we saw this throughout 2021. They were falling away from services. We were seeing unprecedented numbers of drug-related deaths, and we were trying to figure out how we could respond. So what we did is we simplified, in some ways, our court. We've got the umbrella, which is the Dartmouth Wellness Court, with only two programs underneath that umbrella, and those are the mental health program and the substance use disorder program. So all substances now are eligible for inclusion into our program, and our focus really has shifted to whether or not someone's ready to engage. And also one of the primary requirements is always being able to satisfy ourselves that the risk that the person poses is something that our team can manage. So our program is more and more becoming an in-person program again. Our morning meetings, team meetings, are by video and will likely continue in that fashion, but our afternoons are opening up to mostly in-person appearances. And as of last Thursday, I believe it was, most people appeared in person. And I must say it was so refreshing to see people again. It's even when you see them on the screen, it's not the same as you seeing them in person. And so always being busy, we're gearing up for our conference, which is due to occur next Friday. And towards the end, I'll provide you with some information on that. So just to give you an idea of what we've got in Nova Scotia, 2009 was the Nova Scotia Mental Health Court program. 2011, Port Hawkesbury established a wellness court. 2012, we had the Sydney Domestic Violence Court. 2014, the Kentville Drug Treatment and Mental Health Court programs. 2016, Amherst Wellness Court that then added domestic violence in 2022. Halifax Domestic Violence Court in 2018, as well as the Wagmattook Healing to Wellness Court in 2018, which I'll come back to in a minute. Bridgewater started a domestic violence court, drug treatment court in 2019, and now have spread into the area of mental health. Truro is a wellness court, and Shubenacadie Wellness Court planning is underway. And so you'll see from the slide, there's many of these programs are organic in nature without any funding. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Nova Scotia, there's a map and it outlines the various programs that we have. So the Wagmattook Healing to Wellness Court is actually on a reserve in Wagmattook. And this was largely an initiative of the judge in Port Hawkesbury who was dealing with the wellness court in collaboration with the community of Wagmattook. And I came along to lend support, I guess, for the creation of a court. And you'll see that it's quite different than other wellness courts in that it's got the Aboriginal art, it's got a circle bench with everyone on the same level. So it's a wonderful, wonderful spot. So now I'll move into the piece on Wellness Court Steering Committee. So as you saw, there are various courts that are popping up all over the place. They have different criteria. There are different types of courts, criteria that someone may be eligible for in one area may not be have eligibility in another. And so we thought, and also there was quite a disparity as to the degree to which mental health and addictions was working in partnership alongside wellness courts. And so in 2015, we established a wellness court steering group, working group, which then later on turned into a steering committee. And the purpose in the beginning was to build a better relationship and partnerships with mental health and addictions. But we also wanted to include other government departments such as community services, municipal affairs, which deals with housing in Nova Scotia, African Nova Scotian affairs, community members, and First Voice. And so we wanted to gain an understanding as to what the expectations were and trying to manage expectations in the creation of wellness courts across the province, and also to establish some best practices. And so 5 of the best practices that we created, and you'll receive a copy of these slides. And when you click on the blue, you'll be able to actually bring up the document. So the first one, I can't attribute to Nova Scotia. It was a roadmap created by Judge Karen Ruddy, who is a judge in a wellness court in the Yukon. But it's a really nice roadmap of if you're thinking about establishing a therapeutic court, these are some of the questions that you need to ask yourselves. Our court steering committee, however, did develop terms of reference for the group, a best practice framework for establishing and managing wellness courts in the province, as well as a cultural awareness guide to provide some guidance as to the kinds of issues that we need to be aware of when dealing with marginalized, racialized communities. And finally, we developed an evaluation framework to assist wellness courts in being able to evaluate the progress that they're making. So the steering committee was really looking at developing expertise in the area of strategic leadership to assist established wellness courts, but also to provide support to areas that might want to create a wellness court but need it some help in doing so. And we had a strategic planning session in February of 2020. There were, I don't know, 25, 30 people present from all the different organizations, agency, and community that I spoke of earlier. And we came up with 4 strategic pillars that we wanted to focus on. The first was communication and collaboration. The communication and collaboration with each other, with partners, with potential partners in community and government. And the second was building strategic relationships that would allow us to work on the leadership planning that we wanted to do that lead to sustainability of wellness courts around the province and expansion of wellness courts in areas where there presently are no wellness courts. So we were interrupted, as everyone was, by the pandemic, but if there was a silver lining, it was this. We can work differently in more holistic and integrated ways if we're forced to do so. But we shouldn't always be forced to do so. We should be able to work differently in more holistic and integrated ways, even when we're not faced with a major catastrophe. So we are of the view that public safety requires a strong social services safety nets that don't come from justice alone. Justice does not involve only a Department of Justice, but other social service agencies. That it needs to be, there needs to be collaborative release planning for people in custody, services critical to the successful releases were available quickly during the pandemic. So I'm speaking really here of the silver lining and what we were able to do during the pandemic. We were able to use a triage approach to reduce the number of folks in custody, albeit that was short-lived. We were able to identify the need for culturally safe services and the access to crisis intervention for mental health and addictions 24/7. So although those were things that were needed during the pandemic, I would argue those are all things that are needed if we're going to be able to provide successful wellness court environments for folks. So how do our wellness courts promote safe and healthy communities? I think in large part what we do is we reimagine what public safety looks like and recognize where the public interest really lies. And that there needs to be a more restorative human-centered approach to problem solving, similar to what Nicoletta was talking about in her final remarks. We have to meet people where they are, so it's relationally focused, and we've got to pay attention to the connections or interconnections between the people and the issues and the context that they bring to their story, that we assist them in a comprehensive and holistic way, that there is the need for inclusion and participation, not only of participants, but of victims and community at large. And we need to be responsive to the needs of those we're working with and really be forward focused. Using a harm reduction approach based on the social determinants of health is largely the way that we go. And I really appreciated the talk about cannabis, because that's a discussion we often have, whether it's with an individual who is participating in the mental health program or in the substance use disorder program, because cannabis at times, for some, is not a problem and use is not prohibited. For others, it can lead to psychosis and a deterioration of mental health. And so we work on the harm reduction and potential and eventual elimination of use. And in the substance use program, we look at whether cannabis can be assist in reducing the trauma, or whether it could be a gateway to reusing harder drugs again. And we don't make those calls ourselves. We depend on the mental health and addiction specialists to help us in that way. So moving forward, I would say that wellness courts cannot be a standalone initiative, at least in Nova Scotia, and that we're working on a strategy to align with provincial priorities in Nova Scotia. And as with other provinces, our priority is health and transformation of the delivery of health care. And in particular, in one of the documents that's been created by government, they have a number of solutions, and solution 6 was focusing on improving, among other things, mental health and addictions care and services. And so there's they've seen a need for increased collaboration and coordination of departments and organizations. And we, in the wellness court world, see a significant opportunity to align the strategic work of wellness courts with solution number 6. And so just a final word on the conference coming up. It's next Friday. It's Therapeutic Justice, a Nova Scotia Lens, sort of focusing on how we deliver services in Nova Scotia, looking at rural wellness courts, social work, the important role the victims play. The agenda you'll be able to access as well. And it's a free program which is available and is being webcasted through our courts website. And if you're interested, you'll be able to tune in as well. So that is it. I will stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you so much, Judge Williams. It was a very interesting talk, and speaking as my old stomping grounds, I lived in Nova Scotia for 4 years. It was neat to hear this initiative going on while I would have been there shortly after I left, at the very least. So I wonder, just to mention to the point, if there are any questions you'd like to pose to Judge Williams. We have a little bit of time for questions. You can put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. There is a comment there from Eileen McGinty, who I'm assuming is probably one of your colleagues.
She's our crown.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
And I saw her in the participant list. She's an avid social media. I don't know if I called her junkie, but she finds out lots of information for us through social media.
Oh, wonderful. I mean, I don't know if there's a Twitter handle or anything we need to promote here, but certainly if you look up Eileen, that would be an option. So I guess just with a few minutes within it, I wonder, again, it kind of speaks to the earlier conversation. One of the questions that I had was just around, you mentioned that in the original makeup of the team, it was a nurse, a social worker, and I think later, again, as an occupational therapist myself, I'm happy to hear that an OT joined the team. And there was obviously a theme throughout your presentation around that integration and collaboration with the service providers on the whole. And I just wondered if you're able to kind of speak to, the role that those clinicians play in supporting, linking them with appropriate mental health and addictions programs. And I wonder even if you're able to use maybe an example to kind of highlight what that pathway might be for somebody going through the service.
Sure. One of the things I didn't mention, and one of the early lessons learned, was that many people who came to the mental health court had concurrent disorders with addictions. And we were like, OMG, what do we do here? We don't have an addiction specialist on our team. And so we tried to work hard to establish a relationship with addictions. And it was around the time when mental health and addictions were converging, and people were starting to realize that you don't treat one first and then the other, that really you have to work holistically and in an integrative fashion. And so we We schooled our social worker, or she schooled herself, I guess, by being linked to the opioid treatment program and doing a number of courses, and has become basically our addiction specialist. So all three clinicians work in concert. They take on, screening assessment reports for individually for each person, but often do case conferences in determining what's the best, route for this person. They are, for the most part, case managers, so they don't do a lot of the frontline work. However, having said that, they do step in the gap at times to provide the clinical work until they're able to be connected in the community. And so it's been really important to develop those strong relationships with community mental health clinics. And we didn't, our program doesn't jump the queue and our folks don't get priority, but they do have relationships with clinicians. And so if somebody's already connected, it's easy for one of our clinicians to reach out to the person. We get all our participants to sign consents, which allow the sharing of information, which is absolutely vital, so that we're able to do the best and not work across practices with others. Perhaps a good example to provide is the partnership that we established with Veterans Affairs. So we have a number of veterans in our court, and we link to the operational stress and injury clinic and their case managers. And so veterans and first responders often have access to services in the private healthcare area and are able to get connected more easily. And so our clinicians work with the case managers of victims, Veterans Affairs, to ensure that services are available. We do the same with the, connecting people with various programs where they're getting assistance for their drug addictions, whether it's clinics and getting, methadone or Suboxone, those sorts of things. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but they act mostly as a case manager, do provide clinical services as needed, and then are the conduits for the sharing of information back and forth so that we can make appropriate treatment goals and monitor and support people.
And I think that's a really important point, because again, the principle of this conference, and certainly of the work that we're all doing, is making those linkages. And I think you're alluding to kind of those clinicians knowing people and, oh, this is the right service for that one, and that ability for anyone within these services to be able to pick up a phone and say, hey, I might have somebody for you here. And again, thinking about that other presentation, to see how we can kind of reduce those or we'll say better pave the pathways, hopefully out of the justice system and getting that treatment, so that
and that doesn't happen by itself.
No.
I think one of the principles of wellness courts is establishing developed relationships. We need to develop relationships, good working relationships with our team. We need to develop good working relationships with the participants in our program, which takes time. A lot of them coming from a lot of traumatic baggage and not being trusting of the system. But we also need to create those strong linkages and partnerships and relationships with community. And so we've gone on the road as a team and visited mental health clinics, because, personnel changes from time to time. And you sort of go on that roadshow saying, hey, this is who we are. This is what we do. We're interested in working with you. Can you help us? So it's a very deliberate and intense kind of strategy to really build those relationships. Yeah.
Wonderful. And if I can put a plug for the Nova Scotia Early Psychosis Program, that
Yes.
was where I worked in the area. Wonderful, especially for those young folks with an emerging illness. So if there's no any last comments, I don't see any other questions coming up. Judge Williams, if any last closing comments you'd like to make?
I think, and I'm doing this perhaps for Aileen's benefit, we really value the input of victims. And I alluded to that in my comments. Victims are often family members, caregivers, or neighbors. And so there is reason to try and support victims, even to mend relationships, which is part of the restorative approach, holding people accountable, repairing harms. And victims often have some really valuable input that they can provide in terms of, addressing needs and even being, putting together a support plan for an individual. So we've found working with victims to be extremely important. Aileen speaks with all victims. It's a PR campaign on her part too, because some victims think that wellness courts are just a slap on the wrist and there's not real justice. And so it's an opportunity for the Crown to really explain what they are, how they work, and the benefit of them. So I would encourage, a focus on victims when folks are thinking about establishing or improving wellness court programs.
Well, thank you. And again, I think to that earlier point, that diversity of voices, how important that is throughout this process. So Judge Williams, thank you so much for your time, your insights. And just a plug again, that the conference, Aileen had referenced the conference that's happening this Friday. So for anyone,
oh my gosh, it is this Friday, the 28th. Yes.
So for anyone interested in participating, it looks like it's courts.ns is the website where more information is available. So thank you so much again for your time, and we'll